Hello, 4 o'clock Grandmasters. Mike Amori, or the great Mike Amori, I should say. Welcome to the Week 6 update. We looked at a game played by my mentor, really, Sunil Weermantry. Taught me a lot about chess, about teaching chess, about scholastic chess. I can go on and on. He had written a great book called Best Lessons of a Chess Coach. I think I'll include a picture in the update this week. Basically, it was a collection of his favorite teaching games, including some of his own. And we looked at one of them this week in class. In his book, it's called Connect the Dots. And I'll explain how he came up with that title. It is also a really good demonstration of how to play one variation of the Caro Kann. So what I thought I would do is, as we go through the game, first introduce you to, 3 or 4 of the main variations of the Caro Kann, just to make sure you understand them. Even if you don't play e4 or play the Caro Kann as black, which would be c6, it's still useful to go over the main lines just to understand the structure and how these variations get their names and how to play them. So here, with white to play, Sunil played the exchange variation, which is here, which leads to 2 different branches. In the game, he played the move bishop to d3, and I'll explain more about this move when we get there. But first, from that first exchange, let's look at the more common move here, pawn to c4, which is the Panov-Botvinnik attack. That opening is white's, I would say, probably white's sharpest opportunity here, or their chance to really make the game complicated and open, because what normally happens after c4, I'll show you the basic developing moves that come here. Knight f3, bishop e7, and at some point white will take on d5, and by doing so, you'll notice that black didn't take on c4, which normally helps white develop this piece in one move, but at some point white will exchange on d5, and black can take with the pawn, but they tend to take with the knight, creating a position where it's white has one of these that I just highlighted, the isolated d-pawn. And then with some basic developing moves, bishop to d3, knight to c6, pressuring that pawn, castle, castle. And of course, there are things that each player could do outside of this, but these are pretty much standard moves. I think one line here goes bishop f6, so they kind of reroute the bishop to f6 to pressure the d-pawn. And here, it might not be a bad idea to stop your video, pause it. Better yet, if you could set this up on a chessboard and go over some of the features for both sides and ask yourself, why would a grandmaster take either side of this position? And trust me, they have. So from the black side, what would you come up with? Why is this playable for black? Well, white has a weakness on d4 that black's already targeting. So they have a target to play for. They have a very, very solid pawn structure. Quite often this light squared bishop, being that it got hemmed in early, there'll be the move b6. And then this light square bishop will play on the long diagonal. And black has, obvious chances to play here. So then you might ask, well, what's in it for white? And again, pause the video. Why would white take on that isolated d-pawn? So hopefully with a little bit of inspection here, you should know by now, especially if you're a 4 o'clock student, that any position that features an isolated d-pawn and there's still the majority of power pieces on the board, the owner of that isolated pawn has to have piece activity. It's almost impossible to have an isolated d-pawn, have all your pieces on the board, and all of them be inactive. There's something wrong with that. You have an isolated pawn, that means there are no pawns on the adjacent files. And there aren't, which means your rooks will find very comfortable homes. Sometimes even here on d1, you'll see somebody put a rook there to support that pawn, and very often, obviously, you'll see the rooks on c1 and e1 because of the activity. Look at both of white's bishops, and clearly you should be able to see a feature, actually a future, but I guess a feature would work too. This bishop here sometimes will tuck itself down to b1, and the queen and bishop will almost swap with mating threats on h7. This knight has a gorgeous square on e5. This knight sometimes hops into c5, and you can see this bishop, very flexible piece, opportunity all over the board. Is it for free? No, you do have this isolated pawn. So keep in mind, after the exchange variation, the move c4. That's usually reserved for players with white who want to mix it up and play a sharp open game. Okay, let's look at a closed variation. So here's the Caro Kann, e4, c6, d4, d5, and just like in the French, we have an advanced variation, just like in the French. The primary difference between this and the French is here the light squared bishop is open. And what happens is black almost always plays the move bishop f5. It's by far the most common move. And what they're trying to do is create a position with this bishop on f5 that's free. And then following that move, let's say the main line, knight f3, black will then follow up with e6. Now let's go back to knight f3 for a minute and allow me to switch the board. This is what it looks like in reverse. And it's amazing just how fast I can set these pieces up with my hand and switch the board around and have it come out so neat. I've been working on that. You see what black is after here? Very, very solid position, the move e6. And this main line, however, because I'm solid, there are some things going against me as black. So the good thing is I've created this nice pyramid here of pawns, which are all on light squares. And this bishop is outside of that pyramid, making it active and free to move around, leaving my dark squared bishop with lots of places to go. Because the center is completely closed for now, black is afforded the opportunity to tuck their knights in. I'll show you a couple of more moves from the main line. Bishop e2. I think they call this the short variation, named after World Championship contender Nigel Short from England. And you'll see black play moves like knight d7, castle, and then knight e7. So you see those bishops, knights rather, tucked in, and that's only because of the pawn structure. White has so much space in this variation, so the downside is you've given up spaces, black, but the upside is you can afford to take time to maneuver because the board is closed. They sometimes come after your bishop, and we tuck it into g6. Knight d2, main line. The c pawn is left free because what's black's natural break in this position? It's the move c5. And that's why this knight is on d2 to prepare for that break. So what would you play if you were white and black suddenly tried to break your center? Yeah, c3. Okay? Knight c6. And now black loses their light squared bishop. Some of you mentioned, because this happened in Sunil's game too, it's like, hey, what's the deal with allowing this h-file right here leading to my king? What's the deal with that? Why would you give black an open file? That's a question that you would learn a great deal about if you pause the video and kind of thought about it on your own. Black could create a lethal battery here, but it shouldn't be too hard for you to see that the mate can be stopped in one move, and then the knight could come and tempo the queen. It's really not that easy to make use of that h-file. The other question would be, well, if you're going to keep the h-file open for your rook, what in heaven's name are you going to do with your king? You have to be real careful here as black. Castling queenside into a file that already has pawn tension on it is asking for trouble because white can open that part of the board very easily. They could even play moves like b4 at some point, like take once, then b4, b5, a4, a5, and just completely press black on that side of the board. And by the time you double up on the h file, and remember, if I have a pawn on h3, you're probably going to have to sacrifice something to open me up. And it's not that clear how fast you're getting over there. So that's why in this main line, black is sometimes given this file. It continues knight f3, bishop e7. So there's a glimpse of the advanced variation, one of the main lines. I will flip the board. In case you're interested in this from the white side, this is the kind of position you would get. You would have a lot of space. Black has a very compact pawn structure. That's one pawn island because everything is connected by one file. There's only one pawn island here, even though white has the same. You do have an open file here, but you may even consider castling short in this game as black. So there's just a quick look, all right, guys? So you get an idea of where this stuff is coming from. Let's look at the main line, classical of the Caro Kann, which looks like this. There's no exchange. White protects the pawn. And here, black gives up the space by taking. Knight takes. The classical variation involves bishop f5, attacking the knight. Knight tempos the bishop. Bishop goes to g6 to remain on this active diagonal. And then we get kind of cute with the pawns, h4. And then h6, so the bishop will have a place to hide. White actually pushes the bishop deep inside its little bunker there. And once it hides, we get it to come out with a challenge. Black almost always takes the bishop because you don't really want white taking you up here and having a rook on h7. That's probably not the greatest square in the world for a rook. So that being said, they trade. Once the bishop has been developed, see the open c8 square up here? That bishop is gone. And since the bishop is gone, we get to play e6, which creates that Fort Knox variation, the same pawn structure we've talked about in class, making it difficult for black to push d5. So if they continue with natural development, knight f3, knight d7 to cover the e5 square, bishop f4. Then there's this this cute little idea. This bishop very often comes to d2 first, but sometimes they'll play bishop f4. White will get checked. So black will throw in this check. Then the bishop comes back to d2, and then black puts the queen on the square they wanted to put it in the first place. So that would look differently if I put knight d7. So here's where I showed you bishop f4, right? Well, what if I just immediately played bishop to d2, and then black followed up with queen c7? That's the same exact position I showed you. So why does black throw in this check with the bishop on f4? Well, there's two reasons. One, if you come back to d2 and I go to c7, there's the main line, but we each got to play an extra move, and that can be useful if you're trying to make a time control on a clock. Okay, there's another reason. There's this kind of newer variation where black, after the check, will then challenge you with the dark squared bishop, and they're trying to provoke this move c3. It changes the line a little bit, but it's just a way to get you to play c3, and then maybe I can start pushing against these pawns later. But, you know, this is pretty much what the main line looks like. White will castle long, and then knight g to f6. And castling long puts a rook on the d file, and you'll sometimes see white even play the move c4, trying to break with d5. But stop your video. Just look at the position from both sides. Now, from where you are, you won't be able to flip the board. So if you're a Caro Kann player or interested in that, then you would be comfortable playing a position like this. Obviously, you have less what? Hopefully, you all said space. I said that once to a class, and they said hair because they were talking about me. You know, they made a bold joke. I think it was Ben who made the joke. But anyway, here, if you're black and you like solid positions with counterattack, this would be the way to go. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this position. You can develop the bishop, castle short, even castle long in these positions, play c5. You have a game in your hands. You know, it's a real chess game. If you like having more space and some early attacking chances, you might take this with white. Okay? Now, let's quickly go through the game with Sunil, which featured the exchange variation. So this is what it looks like from the black side. We did it on the demo board, and we were concentrating on white. Had he played pawn c4, that's our Panev Botvinnik, but he chose the exchange variation with bishop d3. And this bishop move is designed to play against the bishop here on c8. It doesn't really have a comfortable square. d7 is too passive. e6 blocks the e-pawn. Maybe you can play that, but it feels a little odd, and that's it. I mean, anywhere else you go, you get captured. So the bishop comes out before the knight to make black kind of sweat it out how they're going to get this piece into the game. Knight c6, and here, you know, there are computers that say you can defend the pawn with knight f3, but over the board, most of the human players I know, not that I know that many computers, but most of the human players I know don't want to allow this pin. I mean, you know, it's a chess game, but again, like, why give black a chance to get that light squared bishop in? So white normally defends the d-pawn with the move c3. Black, this is mainline, knight f6, and there are obviously other ways to play for both sides. And here, bishop f4, which takes away that comfortable c7 square we talked about before. And then now black can play bishop g4 because they have the horse up here protecting it. Now, the move c3, it does two things, actually. It didn't just protect this pawn, but it did also open up this diagonal for the queen, which white will make use of once this bishop hits the queen. Black almost provokes or wants white to play this move here, pawn f3. The bishop will run away, and then the knight here might not have its comfortable square on f3. Again, I don't want to play knight f3 right away and walk into a pin, so Sunil played queen b3, attacking black's b-pawn. That pawn was protected with c8. I mentioned in class d7 is also playable. There was one game I saw, went knight d2, e6, knight gf3, bishop takes, knight takes. Now, why would you voluntarily give up a knight for a bishop for a knight? Well, it's because you have these little mini bishops up here. And then the game that I'm talking about, bishop e7, and then white penetrated with knight e5, and black made a terrible mistake and took the knight. Can you figure out why that's a big mistake? I'll leave it up to you. Okay, let's go back to the game. So black protected with queen c8. Okay. Knight d2. Knight d2 is played to support this guy on f3. I don't want to play knight f3 right away and let you blow out my king side. So now pawn e6. You see how these themes repeat in the Caro Kann? Once this bishop is free and outside the chain, black will then set up that pawn chain. This pawn chain is important to study, and I would listen to a couple of comments here and then maybe pause your video and think about what I'm saying and try to make sense of it. In his book, Sunil talks about connecting the dots, and he does it from the white side and for black, really, but let's start with black. Pretend this pawn chain were an arrow. This would be the base of the arrow, and this is the tip or the top. Chess players are taught to recognize pawn chains and put mental arrows at the top or a point at the top and say to yourself, which direction is my chain pointing? And here it's clear that the black chain is pointed toward the queen side. What that usually indicates is the area where you have the most space. Black not only has space to put pieces in here, but they also have a chance later to play a minority attack, which would be using these two pawns, throw them up the board. As a matter of fact, Eric did a beautiful job against Andrew in the class of demonstrating a minority attack. And I asked him, I said, where did it come from? Did you happen to know it from this position? He goes, no, it was just natural, just from looking at the pawn structure. So if you're playing black in this position, let me flip the board for you. You see how different it looks from this side? As black, you should realize you have opportunity on this side of the board. Well, let's reflip and let's highlight white's chain. Based on the discussion you just heard, where is Sunil going to play? Yeah, he's going to play on the king side, on this side of the board. All right, let's see how the game continued. Now knight g to f3. If black takes, we just take back with this knight here. Bishop went to e7, castle short, bishop h5. This bishop is coming back in a hurry to challenge this bishop because it's going to be pointing at the king if he castles that way. Queen c2 making a battery, and now bishop to g6. Sunil takes. You're almost always taking with the h-pawn here. You don't really want to have these pawns blown out on the other side of the board. And a lot of you had questions, or at least those of you who were in class, about why would white voluntarily give up that file. But it's very similar to the other line that I showed you. It's not clear what black's going to do with their king if they want to keep this file open. And some of you did have trouble in class trying to keep this H file. I think you found out very quickly you couldn't get another piece on it. Now, rook A to E1. That was a mystery move that will be revealed in a minute. Black castled short. Again, it's not clear what to do with your king if you don't castle. Queen D3, trying to get to E3, and you'll see why in a moment. Knight H5. And Sunil wants to trade the bishops. His idea is if you take, he gets to put the knight closer to the black king. Queen d8 pressuring the bishop, and now you see queen e3 protecting. Black did not want to take the pressure much longer, so took. We don't want to trade queens here. Knight g5, and now a slight mistake by black. They played queen f6, and I think at this point they realized that this knight was short of squares. Black is trying to trade queens here. If I can get the queens off the board, I may possibly even penetrate with my knight. If I can keep control of that square, black would have no issues here. But white says, and you'll see now the reason why this rook was left on f1 to support f4. And now g4 is going to win the black knight. So black had to retreat. And why not play g4 anyway? Now, as beginners, we don't want you pushing your f and g pawns. At the 4 o'clock class, once you have the center under control, you notice how black cannot break the center. If black could break the center, they would, and then all these pawn moves you're making on the side would get punished. But the center is under complete control, so you can get away with weakening this part of the board. Weakening or strengthening, I don't really know what the right answer is. Knight went to f6, and now, once you have the space and you have it maintained, you can maneuver your pieces. Queen h3. That pins the knight. Isn't that cool? You're nowhere near the knight, but if you move the knight, it's checkmate. So I guess you're pinning the knight. Rook f to c8, giving the king a little luft or air, and also putting the rook on the side of the board where you want it to play. The classic rook lift, and then a mistake. Queen d6. There was a couple of ways to play here. Queen h4, doubling up, but Sunil lost a ton of time, and this is all in his book, debating whether or not to play moves like queen h4 and build up a mating attack, or play an immediate tactic that's available right now. And he finally chose the move queen h8. Ah, look at that, a free queen. Yeah, that's a really good move. You have to take, and then we pick up a pawn, check, get the queen back, and shatter the entire black king side. Rook c7, you pick up a second pawn. Sunil actually lost this game in time pressure, which he describes the whole situation really well in his book. I'm going to leave it at this. It's a long video, but I hope you got some insight into all the variations of the Caro Kann and learned a couple of things about where to play. Let me just remember these guys, okay? The bottom of your chain, the top of your chain, and why it's a good indication or pointer or guide of where you should play. All right, Grandmasters, keep up the good work.